As debaters, we all know the power of speech. But sometimes, we also need to realize that silence is gold. And that's the base principle of side opposition today. We're going to argue in favor of voting by choice in national elections, and we think it reflects the status quo in most jurisdictions worldwide. Voters are going to get the option to decide whether they want to turn up at national elections. There are no legal penalties if you don't go. We stand, like side proposition, for voter education, enhanced if necessary, on polling procedures through public campaigns through a variety of mass media. And we're going to prove our case through three constructive arguments. First, why our side upholds democracy. Second, why it best reflects societal sentiment. And lastly, my second speaker is going to argue that compulsory voting in national elections weakens democratic institutions. Before I hit the constructive matter, let's look at some of the arguments they've raised on side proposition. No thank you all. Let's look at it through two questions. First, is it fair for this policy to be carried out? Second, is it going to work? So let's look at the question of fairness now. And as I've already stated in my model, we stand for the same kind of voter education they're talking about across both developing and developed countries. The question is, why is there a need for mandatory voting in order to allow voter education to be carried out? We never saw a causal link on this question from side proposition. We challenged the next speaker to provide it. But as my speaker raised in an earlier point of information, perhaps it's possible, specifically in developing countries, where corruption is so rampant across the entire political landscape, that people are so disillusioned with the system, they don't even want to vote for a political leader in that case. All they said was, well, perhaps they are now given a greater chance to voice their opinions. No thank you all. What we see in reality is that there are a whole lot of other options for you to express your political opinions apart from the use of the vote. Through protests, through public petitions, for example. We don't see how the vote is the exclusive mechanism that's required. No thank you, ma'am. Then they gave this analogy about how we're going to fine people in order to incentivize them to change their behavior, similar to what we do to people who drink then drive. We think that is not analogous for the simple reason that when you don't vote and you don't express your political opinion through the ballot box, you don't harm someone else. There's no harm to innocent parties. That's the yardstick we use for fines. That's the yardstick we use for criminal punishments, not fulfilled by side proposition. So let's look at the second area now about practical fairness, about practical effectiveness. But yes, madam.
Sir, if you don't go to vote, that means you cannot sign up for a petition because you did not vote at the first place. You don't get political rights.
That's not true. I don't have to decide to vote in a previous election in order to get the right to submit a petition. These are two separate things. You can just do it right now, right here, without having voted in a national election, even if you're below the voting age. Moving back to my argument. We think they raised this idea of the blank vote, and we've got two responses to the blank vote. First of all, we don't think extension makes sense because people don't even want to dignify the electoral mechanism in the first place. But secondly, if your side is really talking about mandatory voting and supporting better representation of the public, if everyone decides to abstain, we don't see how there's better representation in the first place. In fact, we'd like to clarify this misconception right now about voting and public policy. Voting does not allow you to make public policy. You elect representatives in Parliament. To do that, no thank you, madam. Bringing it up to the government doesn't just involve votes. We've already talked about alternatives. We like democracy, but we don't see how the mechanism of mandatory voting in national elections causally results in that. We challenge them to prove this. So that's our practical argumentation, and I've got two final arguments. There is this example of China and how it's not a democracy and they need to give more votes. They need to give people the right to political voice. Well, the challenge in that issue is to give them the right to vote and not even provide for this compulsory voting mechanism, which is an entirely different debate for that issue. And on the last question about whether people are going to react to it positively, my second speaker is going to further rebut this by saying that people are actually going to become resentful if they're forced to vote in elections they don't care about. So that's my rebuttal done. Let's talk about the first issue of upholding democracy. No thank you. Our thesis is that mandatory voting in national elections violates our right to exercise our democratic choices as we wish. Now, human beings have dignity in and of themselves. Why? Because we all have an ability to make a unique difference for the world, and we protect this dignity by giving everyone the same human rights. Key to this is the freedom of choice. Why? because it allows you to reflect your identity accurately. Democracy is underpinned by that choice because it's based upon people choosing to take part in the process of deciding their government. No thank you. Key to upholding democracy is giving people the right to express their voices without distortion. We stop votes from being rigged. We don't allow them to be manipulated when they are counted. That's why. However, when giving people the right to vote doesn't mean obligating them to turn up. Otherwise, you lack autonomy over how and when to express your political voice. This is consistent with all other rights we grant to people. When we allow people the right to free speech, we allow you also to remain silent. You're not compelled to engage in democratic discourse, even if it might be good. Right to free movement also allows you to choose to stay where you are. Thus, to truly uphold democracy, voting shouldn't be compulsory in national elections because it amounts to compelling you to participate in a political system you don't believe in. Before my next point, yes, madam. Yep.
Sir, when you force people to go to school under compulsory education, why wouldn't people retaliate against that?
We don't see how it's going to be compulsory under our system. Voter education is just going to be in the mass media. People can choose whether they want to listen to it. People can choose to further pursue it. We're not going to say, hey, all of you are going to have to sit down for this political studies course today and sit for it. That's exactly not the case. Let's move back to my argument. I'm going to talk now about why it best reflects social sentiment. And here our thesis is that mandatory voting in national elections distorts the decisions of our people. Now, if voting is allowed to be done by choice, there'll be a group of people who don't turn up. But if we make it mandatory, what happens if these people who otherwise wouldn't have voted are now coming to the polls, just to avoid the criminal penalty? This is really unfair, because this group of people may have felt that the entire political campaign and message propagated by all the parties isn't good enough for them to turn up. And if we still force them to come to the elections, the political parties are sent the wrong message, because they think these voters are part of that inflated mandate for their policies which they now choose to stand for. No thank you. We saw this in Kashmir, where voting is compulsory in India as part of the national elections, and people are forced to choose to vote only for India-wide parties despite a strong desire to declare independence for themselves. Now the Indian Parliament can claim that they've got the legitimacy of the Kashmiri region as well. But even if people choose to cast blank votes, it's still wrong to make it mandatory. Why? Because people who may disagree with the system and the entire hierarchy aren't allowed to voice their preferences. For instance, in Scotland and Northern Ireland, people who don't believe in local representatives being sent to the national parliament in London would be silenced if voting were to be made mandatory in national elections. It's really dangerous because now our democratic systems, which were supposed to reflect our true ideas, are now used to violate our rights to political expression. What has side opposition shown? We've shown that voting shouldn't be made compulsory in national elections because it demeans our democratic choice, and in the second place, it distorts the values and the wishes we truly want the political establishment to hear.